We don't yet know exactly how this is going to play out, but is really looking at the opportunities for replacement generation in the same communities or the opportunity to reuse assets.
I'm Carolyn Parrs, communicator, coach, and host of Just Power, a podcast about creating a clean energy future without leaving anyone behind. Join me as we explore the technologies, policies, and human stories that can make clean energy not just sustainable for our planet, but accessible for everyone. Welcome to Just Power. Hi, I'm Carolyn Parrs. And today we're talking with one of the most influential leaders shaping Colorado's energy and climate future. Will Toor is the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office. He has spent decades pushing for solutions that are not only ambitious, but fair. Right? Under Will, Colorado has become a national model for climate leadership, even when energy decisions are increasingly politicized and even sometimes detached of science. Will has taken a firm and sometimes public stand that the transition must be grounded in equity and the lived realities of everyday people. So today we're going to go deep on how his work began, what justice truly means in our rapidly changing energy environment, and the bold steps that Colorado is taking to build a clean energy future that just doesn't empower homes, but empowers people. So here we go. Welcome
Thank you. It's
to our
great
show
to join.
today. Yeah, it must be pretty interesting sitting in your seat these days with all that's going on. So I want to just start before we get into what's happening in Colorado. I really want to go back into the moment or maybe the experience that happened that first pulled you into the world of energy, right? Or climate work. What was that? Was that a personal experience? Was it a political issue, a policy? Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, I've really been engaged on sort of environmental issues more broadly, and then sort of moved from that into climate and energy. Going back to my
Okay.
childhood, growing up in Pittsburgh, I have
All right.
a very clear memory of being on a road trip with my family. We lived in Pittsburgh. My grandparents lived in Philadelphia. We were driving back, and my parents had the idea of stopping at Lake Erie to go swimming because it was a really hot day. And we got to the lake, and this was before the days of the Clean Water Act. And
Okay.
the lake stunk so badly that, I mean, it just stunk, and there was a layer of just muck on top of it.
Oh,
Then all
wow.
three of us kids broke out crying. And that, that was one of the moments where that I think really sort of put me on my pathway.
Isn't that interesting, right? That childhood memory. You know, I had a similar memory. I was East Coast too. I lived on Long Island, right? And we used to go clamming and we dig our heels into the ground and looking for the clams. And one day my dad said to me, "Hey, Carolyn, we can't do this anymore. We're not allowed to get the clams out and we have to stop." And we're like, "What do you mean, Dad?" It was a summer thing we always did. He said, "Well, there's toxicities now, and they've closed us down, so we shouldn't be eating the clams, and so that means we can't get any anymore." And I just thought I must have been like 11 or something, and I thought, what does that mean? Right? So, these childhood things that come into us, and then here we are years later, right? So I know swimming in mucky water is not fun, especially when you're a young kid. It's like, don't make me go. But then you really wanted to go in it, right? So it was such a conflict. All right, let's fast forward, right, to here you are in Colorado, the first state that created an office of just transition, right? Yay, Colorado. So what have you learned? What are some of maybe the successes and the mistakes? I mean, being the first out of the gate, right? There's a lot of pressure on, and people watch you and states watch you on all of that. So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was really part of a legislative package in 2019. sort of right after Governor Polis started and when I started in this job. And the state had just for the first time adopted a science-based climate goals to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And as an
Okay.
element of that, had put in place requirements for electric utilities to cut their emissions 80% by 2030. And
Big.
it was technology neutral, didn't tell them how they had to do it, but we knew, given the economics, that the likely pathway would be retiring sort of old and expensive coal plants and replacing them primarily with wind, solar, and batteries. And so as part of that, there was real concern about the impacts in a handful of communities around the state. If you looked at coal, whether coal mining or coal generation, at the state level, very, very small share of economic activity. And clearly the growth in jobs and revenues from wind and solar and batteries was going to be far greater than
Right.
that state level economic loss. But there were a few communities where coal was really important to the local community. So in Northwest Colorado, the Hayden and Craig area,
Hmm.
so in Routt and Moffat counties, the area around Pueblo in southern Colorado, the coal not as large a share of the economy as it was in Northwest Colorado, but still significant. And then the west end of Montrose County. And so the idea of the Office of Just Transition was to really create an intentional effort to help address, both some of the um, impacts on those communities as a whole, things like property tax revenue, that's very important, especially to their school
Right.
systems, as well as worker transitions. And some of the work has focused on sort of generalized support for economic development in those communities. The area that our office has been most engaged in has been some of the utility planning work, where we were
Mm,
able to work with our Public Utilities Commission and the utilities to try to make sure that in the planning for closing those coal plants and for replacement generation, that there was real attention to those communities. So an
nice.
example would be for Pueblo, when the decision was made to retire one of their coal plants, in 2030, where it turned out that they had bonded against property tax revenues from that coal plant through 2040. So there was an agreement that the utility would continue to provide that property tax revenue for 10 additional
Okay.
years unless they did replacement generation in the community that provided replacement property tax revenue.
Okay. Okay. That helped, lessen the burden of it, right? Because they expected it to be 10 more years or 20 more years,
Yeah,
and then they have this, what they call the stranded assets, right?
yeah.
So, okay. What would you say to other states, right? That as they build their own equitable transition programs, like what are some of those things that you learned and say, hey, maybe you should try it this way, or things that worked well.
Yeah. So I do think that that working with the utilities to address property tax revenues for the communities,
Yeah.
it was a really important element and one that is worth thinking about. Another one that I think is very much a work in progress for us, and we don't yet know exactly how this is going to play out, but is looking at the opportunities for replacement generation in the same communities,
Okay.
and or the opportunity to reuse assets. So, if you think about it, when you've got a big coal plant, that means that you have the transmission lines there to connect to that coal plant. So even if the generation were to go away, what are the other assets that could use that transmission? There's a lot
Hmm.
of discussion going on right now about whether it would be possible to develop a sort of renewable energy based industrial park in the Pueblo area. and there was
I
some
love that.
fascinating work where we were able to work with the utility and the steel mill in Pueblo to support deployment of a really large scale behind the meter solar plant that reduced the energy costs for the steel mill and helped to keep the steel mill in the community. So I think sort of
Uh-huh.
looking creatively at where there may be opportunities both to reuse infrastructure, but also to marry clean energy with sort of industrial development or retention of industrial and manufacturing facilities in those.
Yes, that's very innovative, right? I love that. I travel a lot down 25, right? From New Mexico to Colorado. I live in Colorado. Yay, Colorado. So, and you go through Pueblo, right? And a lot of you see the smokestacks and so forth, and it's so different than the rest of the landscape to see that transformed, right, into a model, frankly, would be just amazing, right? And maybe people from near and far would come to check it out and say, hey, we want to do this too. How'd you do it?
Yeah.
So,
One of the places where there's been sort of really interesting community conversation there has been that there was an energy advisory committee that concluded that what they were recommending was that the coal plants be replaced with a nuclear power plant, and
okay.
but because they looked at it
The
and
big
said,
one or the small module ones?
so I think they were just interested in seeing nuclear power replace
I'll
the
be the
coal
replacement
generation
power
because
for
of the
that.
level
Okay.
of sort of highly paid jobs and property tax revenue associated with it.
Right.
There hasn't been a lot of real traction to date with the idea, largely because from the utility perspective, nuclear is still very expensive and nobody really knows, how small modular reactors are going to work out.
Yeah, it's new. Yes,
So there's a
true.
bit of a timing disconnect there between when the coal plants are retiring and when the utilities might really be interested in investment in nuclear. Um, so there
Hmm.
hasn't been a lot of movement in that area, but it's been very much part of the community conversation.
Okay. Yeah, and we know with, utilities, it has to be reliable, right? Number one, affordable, reliable, um, and and the environmental conditions as well. So if you turn on your lights or you turn on the switch and the lights don't go on, which we hold, as a basic service in our lives, that's a problem, right? So that's why a lot of new technologies that are not utility tested at the utility scale may not see the light of day yet, right? For so that makes a lot of sense. So the conversation's still going, right? There's still solar and wind, right? And batteries still need to expand a little bit more,
A lot
and all
more.
that. Yeah, I know. We got to get beyond 4 hours, I think. Is that the number we're at utility? However, I did go to NREL last year, right, and had a nice tour of NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, for those that may not know it. And they whispered, they're like, yeah, we're working on an 8 hour utility battery right now. But obviously, it's not, it's all in, you know, it's in the innovation stage or pre-production development.
The one really
So
interesting project that's actually moving forward in the Pueblo area is that Excel Energy was able to get federal funding under the Biden administration, and I know there's been some uncertainty about funding, under the new administration, but it was focused on deploying a 100-hour iron air battery in the Pueblo area. It's essentially a battery that, at the simplest level, you could think of it as you you charge it up and then you let it essentially rust, and that oxidation releases energy. And so
wow,
it,
I
it's
never
a,
heard of
it's a
that.
very promising technology, but in very early stages of deployment.
Okay. Well, that's what I love about Colorado, right? I have to say, in a lot of different areas, not just energy, definitely forward thinking and progressive on that level. So I'd love to hear more about that as that unfolds. So just transitioning a little bit, Colorado has, when I just looked at your site and some of the reports that I received has three climate pillars, right? Mitigation, adaptation, and then equitable transition, right, as a pillar. Can you just touch on each one of those, what those mean? And then I'd like to dive a little bit more into the equitable transition part.
Yeah. So, on climate mitigation is really about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and doing our our part to get on the trajectory that is needed in order to stabilize the climate. And so we have a fairly comprehensive greenhouse gas roadmap that is essentially our action plan for how we're going to achieve our targets, really
Okay.
focusing in on that 2030 target of cutting emissions in half by 2030. Lots more that'll need to be done to get to net zero by 2050, but the focus right now is,
Emissions in half. Okay.
and that really focuses on five major sectors. So, electricity generation, transportation, methane emissions from oil and gas production, because Colorado is a major oil and gas producing state, um, emissions from industrial and manufacturing operations, and then pollution basically from burning natural gas or propane in buildings. And so, could talk for a long time about it, but would just say that there's a mixture of sort of regulatory approaches, public investment, and incentives for climate action in each one of those areas in order to
Okay.
drive emissions down. And would say that the philosophy behind it has been very much to look at policies that will simultaneously reduce pollution and make people's lives better. So, very much of a focus, for
Mm,
instance, on how do we do things in ways that will make clean energy cheap rather than making dirty energy expensive. And looking, when it comes to buildings and transportation and opportunities, to really try to expand housing supply and affordability in those places where um, people will be near jobs and schools and hospitals and the things that they need every day,
yeah.
so that we can both help tackle the housing affordability crisis while also reducing emissions from buildings and transportation. When it comes to adaptation, that is very much looking at the fact that whatever we do as a state, we know that we are going to be seeing impacts from climate change, and that Colorado is very much on the front lines of that. That
Yes.
whether you're looking at forest fires and both their direct impacts and their impacts on things like the ability for people to insure their homes, whether you're
Yeah.
looking at drought and heat and the impact on agriculture, whether you're looking at the impact on the ski industry, just
Yes.
a wide variety of direct impacts. And so a lot of work going on to try to
Mhm.
um, help minimize the impacts of those changes. And examples would be work happening at our Public Utilities Commission and with our utilities to try to both harden the grid so that it's less impacted by wildfires, and to reduce the chance of power lines sparking and causing wildfires. The worst wildfire that we've had in Colorado history was the Marshall Fire a few years ago.
I
That
yeah, I remember
you
that.
and the, it is
Not even in
believed.
the mountains, right? It was like in a suburban neighborhood, in the
Yeah,
Boulder
it
area.
it was right before Christmas. It was incredibly dry. There were 100-mile-an-hour winds, and it was a grass
Yeah.
fire that entered the suburbs. It burned right across an interstate highway, US 36,
Wow.
and burned 1,200 homes. And it's believed that sparking fire or power lines were likely one of the sources of ignition. Other examples would be a lot of work that is going on in multiple watersheds to try
Hmm.
to address the strains on our water supplies. Certainly the best known is a multi-state effort right now to figure out how to
Okay.
manage the Colorado River going forward.
Right.
So lots of work to do on that adaptation side. And then, there, it's also, I think, really important that as we move forward in both mitigation and adaptation, that we really keep equity in mind. And just a few examples of sort of how that plays out. One would be as we work on the transition to cleaner vehicles. We know that electric vehicles are are better vehicles, and that over the long term they save people money because you spend so little on maintenance and on fuel costs. But that there's a real barrier to lower income people being able to afford an EV because of the higher upfront costs. And so Colorado has done some really interesting things in policy design, both with our state tax credit, where the tax credit is larger for the lowest cost vehicles than it is for higher cost vehicles. There's an extra $2,500 for vehicles that are under a $35,000 manufacturer suggested retail price.
Has that had an impact? Have you
So,
noticed the numbers on that?
I think it really has. We've actually seen, for instance, that if you look at some of the lower cost EVs like Nissan Leafs and the lower model price Nissan Arias, that Colorado has just sort of topped the charts in sales and leases in the nation for those
All
vehicles.
right. Okay.
And then we also created a program called the Vehicle Exchange Program, which is an income qualified program for low income residents. That's essentially a cash for clunkers program where you can get up to $9,000 towards the cost of a new EV on top of those tax credits. If
Oh,
you're
okay.
low
That's really
income
good.
and
Do you
you're
trade your car in, basically?
yes, basically.
Yeah. It's like what they did with refrigerators.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, very much like that. Another example is, we were just a week ago, we launched a large home electrification rebate program that is targeted to low and moderate income Coloradans. So for low income Coloradans who are below 80% of their area median income, they can get up to 100% of the cost of projects covered, up to a maximum of $14,000 per household for installing
okay.
heat pump water heaters and induction stoves and the
Nice.
associated wiring. And then for folks who are between 80 and 150% of AMI, they are eligible for the same types of rebates, but it can cover up to half of the cost of a project. And we think that is a pretty exciting program, both because it will reduce energy use and emissions, make people's homes more comfortable, and I think for many lower income folks who don't have cooling, heat pumps will not only give them lower emission and more comfortable heating in the winter, it will provide them cooling, which
Yeah.
is a really important element of adaptation as we move towards many, many more days, over 95 or 100 degrees, when you look at future climate projections.
Yeah, we got to get everybody on heat pumps, right? Ultimately. So those are great examples of some of the things you're doing around equity. I have a question on this, right? With the current political landscape that we're in right now, and even the word equity being a little dicey, right? It does. How are you tackling that? Because actually, you still have an office of, the justice. You still have language you talk about, and we're talking about it here. And it's like you're pressing forward no matter what. So tell me a little bit about how you're handling that as a state.
Yeah, I think from the state perspective, I don't think that we see really any change in direction.
Okay.
We are still focused on justice and equity. Certainly, we know that there have been some changes at the federal level, and for federally funded programs, some of those programs, you know, need to change in response to new federal guidance. That said, I would say most of the practical changes, at least in the programs in the energy space, it's really changes in how the federal government is talking about programs more than how they're administering the programs. An example would be the home energy
Okay.
rebates. You no longer have to provide equity reporting on the home energy rebates in your federal reporting. But by federal law, those rebates are targeted at low and moderate income households. So,
Mm,
the sort of real the people who are going to be receiving them are the same people who would have been receiving them, where it's just really talking about them in a different way. Um, there are a few places where we see some changes. So, for instance, federal funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There used to be um, reporting required, and when you were allocating funds, requirements to be thinking about locating chargers in areas that would benefit disproportionately impacted communities and environmental justice communities. That's no longer there in the federal funding. For Colorado, because we have so much state funding going into very similar programs, we're able
yeah.
to simply continue to build charges in those areas using our state
Hmm.
funding. So
Yeah.
again, it hasn't really had
Yeah.
a big sort of on the ground practical impact. The one place
Yeah.
where we've really seen a big impact from the change at the federal level has been on our low income solar programs, where for reasons that
Solar for all.
yeah,
Yeah.
solar for all. The federal government did cut off funding for that, and we're now part of multi-state litigation in both federal district court and the federal claims court,
Okay.
trying to restore those funds. But that's the one place where there was really I think, a significant program that would have provided benefits to tens of thousands of low-income households in the state. That really is on hold.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, that's congratulations on keeping like just the foundation of what the state believes in, pressing forward. There's so much local and state driven climate policy continues, programs that have continued that I've heard of around this, right? So, yay for that. And then there's been areas like you just mentioned, like the Solar for All and others that have had some impacts. But the states are getting stronger, through this, right? So that's so refreshing to hear. I started this podcast almost a year ago, and at the very beginning, it was like, "Uh-oh, what's going to happen?" Everybody started freaking out, frankly, and the private equity and states and so forth have strengthened, I think, through all of this. So that's so good. Let me we're talking about equity right now, and even operationalizing it, because so many states, even utilities, talk about it, and it you see varying impacts around it. So it seems like Colorado is a leader around this, of creating their policies and programs and actually doing it, and innovating through it. But what are some of I would say the hardest truths you've learned about embedding equity into climate policy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what would you say to other states that are maybe struggling around this too?
Well, one of the things that I think has been sort of a really interesting learning for us and is an ongoing challenge is really trying to understand the diversity of perspectives within communities. And,
Yes.
this was something that for me, I think was particularly a lesson. A couple of years ago, we were working on adopting greenhouse gas emissions regulations for industrial manufacturing within the state that cover our 22 largest manufacturers. And it was a very contentious process, as such
Mhm.
things often are, with hearing from local elected officials and you know workers in the facilities and environmental justice organizations and the
Right. That's something to
manufacturers
the.
and wide variety of perspectives. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the diversity of perspectives we heard from within communities, where we would hear from some people who were wanting us to adopt the strongest possible regulatory requirements, even if that would have the effect of potentially leading to manufacturers scaling down their operations or moving operations to other places, because folks felt like the community interest in sort of the local air quality impacts was so great. But then we would hear from other people in the same communities who would be very much, we really want the clean air benefits, but
Yes.
don't do anything that is going to affect the jobs in our community or the tax base that provides our services. And it became clear that there was no one perspective that was really the perspective from these communities, and that you really
Okay.
couldn't take sort of at face value anybody who was claiming to speak for the communities, because there were so many different perspectives that different groups
Mm.
would bring forward. The other thing that I would say that was interesting in that process was really seeing the diversity of opinion between representatives of labor unions and of many of the environmental justice organizations, and realizing again that there were a bunch of folks engaged who had very good motives, and who came to very different conclusions on what they wanted to see out of this. And so, for us, it ended up meaning that we had to make judgment calls that in some ways didn't make anybody happy.
Right,
But that,
right. I
but
was
that
gonna say, how do you take all of that in,
yeah,
and then it has to come out over here, right?
uh,
Like, to have the stance.
ultimately where we landed in that, I think, was an interesting balance, although some people think we got it wrong. Um, that focused on making sure that we were incentivizing technology improvements to reduce pollution, not incentivizing companies to move out of state to do their production, because we felt like there's no actual climate benefit from just moving production somewhere else.
Right.
And if we actually had the effect of just moving production somewhere else, it doesn't become a model that other states are going to be interested in if it's hurting your economy. Um, but we also felt like an important part of this was building in some additional bar for emissions reductions occurring on site in disproportionately impacted communities. So we were really trying to sort of set a balance that was really trying to maximize air quality benefits in the communities that needed local air quality benefits the most, without
Mhm.
incentivizing companies to disinvest in those communities and hurt them in other ways. And so, again,
Yeah.
lots of people from different perspectives, I think, would have different thoughts on whether we got the balance right. But that, I
But,
think, that,
you're talking to them. You're talking to the communities, though, and that's the important part, really, right?
that's certainly an important part of it. And then listening to sort of very diverse perspectives. So I
Right.
think the lesson that I would have, thinking about other states who would be addressing these issues, is just that it's important to, I think, really go in with sort of both eyes wide open and with your ears really open to hearing the sort of those
Mm.
very diverse perspectives, and realizing that there really isn't a right answer for how to do this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally, right? Because you might have your own biases as well, right? But you really have to come into it open to hear, is what I'm hearing you say, and listen. And then from listening to take it and like to make sure that everyone's voice or the diverse voices are heard, and then bringing all that into a place where decisions are made.
Yeah.
So that's real to me. climate leadership. So thank you and bravo for you. So you said that each community has a diversity of opinions, a diversity of thoughts, but they also have communities also get hit with climate impacts, unevenly as well, right? It's diverse as well. So if you had to like name the toughest climate burden that you think is facing Coloradians, right, today, what would that be? And how are you handling that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's hard for me to pick out like what's the one single toughest
It's
issue.
fires, right?
Yeah, you know, I I do think that the the biggest like disaster, sort of climate driven disasters that we see really are around wildfire, because that's where we really see
Yeah.
people.
For
You
utilities
know,
as well, right? They're all over that on handling that and detecting it before it goes too far as well.
yeah,
So, yeah.
and
Oh,
and the actual disasters, and then the impact on insurance and the potential for properties becoming uninsurable. I think that that's a huge issue.
huge. Yeah. I have a friend who lives up in the mountains, right? On the Flatirons
Yeah,
Mountains up there for 30 years. And recently, uh, uh, she got dropped, right, from insurance. And there was just one insurance company that is now up there for
yeah,
everybody. And they had to do a lot around their homes, a lot to make it as secure as possible. But there's always still the threat that, you can be dropped like that. And then you have a bunch of homes. I think California's, obviously experiencing this as well. As you are not insured, I think that's going to happen more and more.
yeah,
Um, that's something huge to tackle as a state.
yeah. It is, and I know there's a lot. I'm not directly involved in it, but I know there's a lot of work being led by the administration and by our insurance commissioner, and working with the legislature, trying to work on solutions there. I know there's been a lot of work looking at issues around utilities and wildfire. There's also, I think, a really interesting connection to the work that we've done trying to enable housing in our cities, because despite the Marshall Fire, overall the wildfire danger in our urban areas is much lower than it is in sort of ex-urban development. And
Okay.
one of the dynamics has been that there's more housing that's gotten built in high wildfire areas, partially because we've made it so difficult to build housing within our cities. And so the work
Ah,
over the last couple of years to really try to legalize denser housing within cities, one of the benefits that it will have, I think, is shifting more of the new development into cities and less of it in areas that are in the wildland urban interface. And we actually did some modeling working with an economics consulting firm, Eco Northwest, to try to understand the likely impact on land development patterns. And it did show that those policies would overall lead to a significant decrease in new development in the high wildfire danger zones. So that's just
okay.
it. It's really, uh, I think, a blessing when you're able to do policies that really have multiple benefits, both on the
Yes, yes,
mitigation and adaptation front.
yes, yes. You're a busy man these days. Well, um, let me talk a little bit now about, I wanted to hit on this whole energy affordability.
Yeah,
It's in the news. It was in the last election, right? And, as we head into a future where higher energy demands, data centers, right? We're seeing that and the impacts of AI, electrification, and we are talking weather as well. So some, Coloradians, it's from low even to moderate income folks are struggling with this rising energy costs, upwards of 40, sometimes 50% higher for them. So how do we accelerate our clean energy, right, future, this transition, and also meet this affordability? And what's affordable to one person is not to the other. It's complex, right? So what's happening in Colorado around this?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And, I would start out with kind of a couple of pieces of context. One is that we've been in an interesting place in the United States over the last 20 years where electricity demand has been basically flat for 2 decades.
Right.
It, essentially because of energy efficiency and largely because of the transition from incandescent bulbs to LEDs, that the reductions in energy use associated with that have largely um, tracked with the increase in demand from other sources and from growth, so that you've had less than 1% annual increase in electricity demand.
Right.
That's kind of an anomaly. Prior to that, energy was growing much faster, and in most of the rest of the world, it's been growing faster. Um, but we've had this 20-year period where there's been very little increase in electricity demand. We're now, seeing demand really trending upwards for, as you said, a variety of reasons, from adoption of electric vehicles to people installing
Hmm.
electric heat pumps to more use of electricity in a variety of industrial operations, and then data centers and AI. And it's not putting us really into unprecedented territory, but it's going to take us back to some of the kind of growth rates that we had a few decades ago that we're not really
Right.
used to right now. So that's sort of one of the issues. Another
Hmm.
issue is that really the extreme weather events, driven largely by climate change, are increasingly stressing the grid. And that in order to make the grid reliable in the face of that, there's significant investments in not so much the generation side as the electric transmission and distribution systems that are needed. And then you add to that the fact that utilities have basically underinvested in their distribution systems over the years. So there's a lot of catch up to be
Yes.
done. It turns out when you look at the like inflation adjusted cost of electricity, the vast majority of the increase in costs has come from transmission and distribution, and the cost of
Right.
generation, even as we've been going through this transition to clean energy, haven't really gone up. And which sort of
Okay.
makes sense because wind and solar have been the cheapest sources of electricity, and most new generation has been wind and solar. So you're adding lower cost generation to the mix, and that has helped to sort of moderate the increases. But we're still seeing all over the country uh, some significant increases in electricity costs. While it may be a little bit of cold comfort, Colorado is in a relatively good place. The Citizens Utility Board does a ranking of states by energy affordability, and typically what we've seen is that if you look at total utility bills in Colorado, they're generally in the top or the bottom two or three in terms of costs. So
Okay.
Colorado has been one of the most affordable places for total utility bills in the nation, but we're still seeing increases and need to manage those. I think there's you know a number of things going on there for the investor-owned utilities that are where their rates are regulated by our Public Utilities Commission. I know that our PUC has been very focused on really scrutinizing all of the proposed investments by the utilities and trying to, in particular, make sure that investments that are designed to serve new load, that new load is actually coming. Because there would be nothing that would drive up costs more than to spend a lot of money to serve new load, and then that data center doesn't actually get built or
Yes,
Um,
there's been cases like that,
yeah,
or extremely delayed, right? And then the burden goes on the community.
yeah.
So yeah.
But interestingly, they the PUC also did some long-term modeling, and what they found was that because so many of the costs that are coming are essentially fixed costs, like we need to do the investments in wildfire upgrades, we need to do the investments in upgrading the distribution system. Those costs are coming sort of regardless of policy needs or regardless of what happens with growth on the system. That if we are intelligent and sort of very intentional about how we site new load, and we work with data centers to try to put them in places, for instance, where we have existing transmission, not in places where you would have to spend billions of dollars in building new transmission. And if we set the rate structures right for those new loads so that they're not being subsidized by other customers, that in fact by spreading the fixed costs over more kilowatt hours of sales, it could benefit all customers. And what their modeling found is that if we had no load growth, we would see really significant increases in electricity bills over the rate of inflation over the next
Oh,
25
interesting.
years. But that with a high electric load growth scenario that is appropriately managed, we could mitigate those cost increases and
Mm.
keep it to the rate of inflation. And so, the governor about a year ago did a letter to the Energy Office and our Utility Commission and our Office of Economic Development, directing us all to work together to try to make sure that we're moving towards that low electricity cost inflation future with intelligently sited new loads rather than that high electricity cost future.
In closing, so we talked about a lot today. We talked about the federal retreat on some level. We talked about the community strength. We talked about the data centers and the new pressures on that and all that you do. What gives you hope right now?
One of the things that I find most hopeful is really what I think is the inevitability of the transition to clean energy and electrified technology. That when you simply look at the underlying sort of physics and economics of it, if you think about something like moving to solar and batteries, for you make that investment and it's in place for the next 30 years,
Yeah.
compared to having to go out and buy gas and oil and gasoline today and then tomorrow, and coal, and then having to buy it again the next day and the next day.
Yeah.
you know
Which is
just
what we were been
the
used to.
underlying
Yeah.
economic logic to moving to these long-term investments that avoid the need for the ongoing um, ongoing purchases of fossil fuels, I think is just so large, and not just here but around the world. And you think about
Yes.
the number of countries that are fossil fuel importers, not fossil fuel producers, where it is completely in their interest to move to lower cost, cleaner technologies. You know, I listened to a great podcast recently on David Roberts, the Volts podcast, where he was doing an interview on the sort of inexorable rise of these technologies that I thought was one of the most hopeful things that I've heard in quite a while and was very convincing.
Okay. Yes, maybe we can get that in our show notes.
Yeah,
I need to hear that.
yeah.
Okay. Well, Will, thank you so much for joining us here today, right? How can people learn more about what Colorado's up to, what you're up to, right? Where would they go?
Yeah. So the Colorado Energy Office website really has links to all of the different work that we're doing.
Nice. Okay. I'm going to have all of that in the show notes for you, right? And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today, right, on Just Power. The path forward is getting clearer and clearer. It sounds like a lot of that is being figured out by really smart people. But we're all in this together, right? So let's walk it honestly, with equity, with shared value and purpose. So until next time, happy Thanksgiving to everyone, to you, Will, to your family. And remember, we're all in this together. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Just Power wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really loved it, leave us a review and tell everyone you know about our podcast. It's going to take all of us to create a clean energy future that leaves no one behind.